Let's bring in CNN law enforcement analyst Charles Ramsey. He's a former Philadelphia police commissioner, and Marc Morial, president of the National Urban League. Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you both for being here. We're so grateful to have your voice in this. Charles, I want to start with you because you said something last night that I think got a lot of people's attention. You said, quote, "You may be legally justified, but just because you can doesn't mean you should." Help us understand how you need to change that thought process in police departments. And do you think the chief here in Atlanta, Chief Shields, stepping down will make a difference?
Well, first of all, you know, the law is one thing, but your training and use of force is a separate issue. And there's nothing more important than sanctity of life. And that's what I mean. You may be legally justified, but if it's not necessary, if it's not reasonable, if it's not proportional, and that's with any use of force, then we need to hold those officers accountable, because you just don't shoot people unless you absolutely have to. It has to be a last resort. And sometimes under the law, technically, you could be justified. I keep hearing about, you know, he didn't have a deadly weapon. Well, there are many jurisdictions where it doesn't have to be a deadly weapon, just a dangerous weapon. So we need to look at all those kinds of things and train accordingly, and then hold people accountable if they do not meet those standards. As far as the chief goes, you know, she mentioned in her resignation letter that there's a gap that needs to be filled. Well, not just in Atlanta, it's across the country. The reality is there is a negative subculture that exists within policing. It has to be rooted out. There's absolutely no question about that. I personally don't think you have to ban or disband policing in order to do it, but serious steps and serious reform has to take place if we're going to close that gap. It's not going to happen overnight, but it needs to start right now, and it needs to happen as quickly as possible.
Mr. Mayor, let me ask you about the reforms, because all weekend, for several weeks now, we've been talking about the role of police and the scope of policing, asking police to do too much. This man was asleep in his car. And in this call to defund police, often that umbrella reaches over too many angles of this conversation. Before we talk about how they executed or performed the job when they arrived, should this have been something that police were called to deal with, and how that fits into the narrative of the broader conversation?
Well, first of all, good morning. Maybe calling the police was the instinctive thing that the employees of Wendy's did. But when the police arrived, seeing a man asleep in his car, what should have been triggered is there a medical emergency here? If that had been a 65-year-old white gentleman, I bet they may have called EMS, called for a wellness check, called for a medical intervention, asked the gentleman to pull his car over to the side to see if he needed assistance. I think that from what the witnesses reported that I heard last night from the family's lawyer, it's also that when the initial arrest took place, they were having a conversation, and then all of a sudden sought to physically apprehend him. So the officer's initial apprehension may have been provocative. It may have been instigative in terms of what conflict we saw in the tape on the ground. But there's no doubt that the rethinking of policing, there's got to be a reimagination. I think it goes beyond simple reforms. And that reimagination and that rethinking is exactly what you said, Victor. Are there duties and responsibilities where a crisis intervention unit would have been better? Even if the police are called out immediately, I am concerned about a culture of policing would suggest that the response to any call for service is an arrest, is an apprehension, is taking someone to jail. This man obviously was in some distress. He fell asleep at the wheel of his car driving through Wendy's. Maybe there was something else there. So this was not this was an unnecessary death. And I think I tend to have a different perspective than Chief Ramsey, and that is the officer's life was not threatened, nor was the life of any other person threatened when deadly force was used. And I think that's the appropriate standard that police officers follow. I think that's what they're taught. And in this instance, there was no no suggestion that that officer may have been upset that his taser had been taken away. That officer may have been upset that this man was able to get away from two officers, but this was not a necessary death.
Charles, I want to let you respond to that and also say this. As I heard last night, and correct me if I'm wrong, that tasers do not shoot continually. They essentially have one or two shots in them before they need to be reloaded. So with that said, would there have been a reasonable thought for that officer to realize that even as Brooks was running away, he would not have that ammunition to hurt anybody else?
Well, let me start by saying that my view is not different from that the mayor just stated. You know, it is a last resort. Your life, the life of another, has to be in immediate jeopardy before you resort to deadly force. So we are not on a different page when it comes to that at all. As far as tasers go, yeah, they're limited in terms of the number of times you can discharge. When he turned, if he fired, which it looked like maybe he fired those prongs, but that weapon then becomes useless because it has to recycle. You only get so many charges that you can use, that they cycle through. I think it's 15 seconds before it can even be used again. So again, you know, that shooting was not, it could have been handled differently. It was not necessary in my opinion. And what was said earlier is the same thing my wife, who's a clinical psychologist, said, and that is de-escalation. What happened with the initial contact? But having said that, and it's easy to say we need other approaches, the reason police are being asked to go to these kinds of calls is because you don't have social services available in the evening and in the middle of the night. And so if we're going to reimagine policing, which I agree it should be, then it's going to have to be, these other services have to be adequately staffed and funded.
Yeah.
And funded. And the problem is the cities over the years have cut services, have cut social services, and the police are around 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's easy to call 911, let the cops handle it, and then when bad stuff happens, we say, well, why are they handling it? So there has to be a real serious approach to dealing with this, and it's going to require some funding in order to make it happen. And so you can defund police, but track where the money goes and make sure it goes where it's intended to go. If you want community-based social services, then make sure that's where that money goes.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we have run out of time for this conversation, Mr. Mayor. But, Chief, let me ask you to stick around because we are expecting that we're going to get in within the next few minutes new body cam video from this incident that ended with the death of Rayshard Brooks. So we want to keep you for that analysis.
Okay.
Again, Marc Morial, president of the National Urban League, former mayor of the city of New Orleans, thank you so much for your insight this morning.
That's Christi. Thank you.
Thank you.